Hello and welcome to Soberanía, the Mexican Politics Podcast. I'm your co-host, José Granados, Ceja, a Mexican journalist living and working here in Mexico City. I'm a staff writer over at Venezuela Analysis and host of their podcast as well. And as always, I'm joined by my co-host, Kurt Hackbarth. Kurt, welcome to the show. How you doing?
Doing very well, José Luis. Oh!
There it is. I can hear it in my head, actually. I heard it.
So like the classic Dylan video of yesteryear, you know? Yeah. If anyone has gag ideas, please send them in, because we've got a lot of episodes ahead of us.
That's right. That's right. But we have a big announcement at the start of the show. So we mentioned it in passing last week. We finally confirmed all our guests. We are going to have a very special presentation this Sunday. So we've reached the end of López Obrador's sexenio, and obviously we thought that this would be an appropriate time to revisit his political life, everything from the very humble beginnings to the National Palace, and obviously with the transition upon us, a good moment to reflect on just his impact, everything he did. Who was López Obrador? Will he be remembered as a good president, which was always his desire, which he said at the beginning of his term? And of course, what does this mean for Mexico moving forward? Right? Claudia Sheinbaum, his successor, handover to her, which is coming up very, very soon. We're talking about a question of days now. It's kind of extraordinary to think about. Yeah. If you think about where López Obrador began, the fraud, the desafuero, the buying of votes in 2012, the victory in 2018, that chapter is very much coming to a close. I've had a lot of people ask me, oh, are you, worried that he's going to continue to have political influence? I'm like, no, I trust he's going to retire. I mean, he'll probably have a column. He'll probably be writing, he's going to write some books. So it'll still be visible, but I think he's very much closing this chapter of his life and a chapter for the life of the country. So this coming Sunday, 5 p.m. here in Mexico City. So that's 4 p.m. in Los Angeles or 7 p.m. in New York. And you'll have to work out the rest of the time zones there. Those are the only ones I know off the top of my head. 5 p.m. Sunday with special guests, Violeta Vázquez Rojas, who is a friend of the show, great political analyst who always has to put up the good fight against all the conservatives on those talk shows here in Mexico, as well as a new friend of the show, Juan Pablo Morales Garza, who's also going to be sharing with us his analysis, his experience, his thoughts on López Obrador and his political life here in Mexico. Kurt, any comments here for our guests here with this live stream coming up?
Well, it's going to be a really interesting program, with the two of us and with our two guests who have also lived and studied and worked extensively in the United States, right? So they kind of just like us, kind of have this experience of seeing it from both sides, right? There are people here who have no idea what Mexico is like without López Obrador being on the political scene, right? And you mentioned, going back to the desafuero in 2004, the election 2006, 2012, 2018, these last 6 years. But, it goes well before that, right? It goes back to, his time as Presidente Jefe de Gobierno, mayor of Mexico City, starting in 2000, only the second left mayor ever, to win the mayorship of Mexico City. It goes back to his presidency in the PRD in the 1990s, right? And his fight against Mexico's bank bailout, FOBAPROA, among other things, right? Which really brought himself and the party to national prominence. And it goes back to the first marches, from Tabasco to Mexico City, the Exodus for Democracy. At the infancy of all this, when they couldn't even get the federal government to recognize victories of the PRD at the municipal level. The first victors of the PRD at the municipal level, they couldn't even get those recognized. This was in the context of those early martyrs of the PRD, some 600 people assassinated. This was the idea back then, was that the PRI, in order to create this false democratic opening in Mexico, the PRI was going to ally with the PAN and, create what AMLO came to call the PRIAN, and they were going to basically liquidate the PRD. And that's not an exaggeration in terms, right? And so now we're at the end of that, where the PRD just lost its registry as a party and disappeared as a party. So if we go back to the 90s and, even before that, to the beginnings of his career in the 70s and 80s, there's a large swath of Mexico who really can hardly conceive of what Mexico will be like without López Obrador, striding across, and very literally, those 1,000-kilometer marches to Mexico City, right? Striding across the political scene. So we're going to talk about all that with two excellent guests, with our own humble analysis there. Mexico says goodbye to AMLO. And, if you've been following our analysis, if you saw, this kind of the outpourings of emotion at the final grito de independence, right? How the kind of approval ratings he's leaving office with, you understand kind of how important this is of a historical moment for the country. Right? And I think it's really timely and proper that we do this kind of historical retrospective to break through the noise, which is the point of this podcast, is to break through the noise. Because if you just follow the standard English language press, all you've gotten is about 95% negative articles on AMLO over 6 years, and without analysis. If you want to do a critique, there's things to critique, and do your analysis. That's fine. But what you get is really just garbage in, garbage out of the U.S. media, and so that would leave one to not understand what has been happening down here, and then fall into the false trap of saying, Mexicans love a messianic leader. They love the strong leader. Just fall into the stereotypes, right? They love the religious leader. They're bought off by social programs. Just all the stuff that we've talked about. So our analysis is going to get past all of that and help all of us to understand more this really important historical phenomenon in Mexico. And there will be continuity, but this is still kind of a momentous moment, October 1st, for the Mexican people.
It's a big deal. It's a really big deal. This is going to be pretty monumentous, and it's going to be definitely turning a page. I like the phrase you use, breaking through the noise. There's this phrase we use in Spanish, romper el cerco mediático, right? Which is a bit tough to kind of translate. It's like breaking through the blockade, but I like that, breaking through the noise. That's what we do here. And of course, thank you to everybody who's joined our membership here on YouTube. And we really appreciate all that help. And we'll give you a special attention during the live stream. So be sure to join us in the chat. Yeah. We'll be able to tell who you are. They give you a special little icon. So if you haven't joined and you want to join now, and we'll make sure to respond to your questions during the live stream. And of course, invite our guests as well. I want to thank them also for agreeing to participate. It's great to have a plurality of voices there, different experiences. It's going to be a lot of fun. So please join us Sunday, September 29th, this coming Sunday, 5 p.m. Mexico, 4 p.m. in LA, 7 p.m. in New York for this special live stream. Mexico says goodbye to AMLO. All right, moving on to the show. This is our rundown for today. Opposition. We talked about them last week, but they seem to be going from bad to worse. So we're going to talk about them going from the right to the far right with a lot of dangerous kinds of attitudes and even some expressions of violence more recently that I think is worthy of consideration. We don't want to be alarmist, but there's certainly a worrisome trend, I think, developing, and we're seeing more and more of it. And so hopefully we can have some kind of more calm minds in order to try to continue with this peaceful transformation, this peaceful interaction with the diverse political forces in this country, which seems to be slipping away. Morena held its Congress just yesterday on Sunday, September 22nd, and it means big changes, right? This is the party in power. This is a very interesting movement, particularly for people who are interested in political movements in general. During her speech, and we'll play a piece of it during the show, Claudia Sheinbaum said, I don't think it's an exaggeration to say that we are the strongest, most unified political force in the world. And I think there's a lot of reason to suspect that that isn't the case in terms of the struggle to resist, to build an alternative to neoliberalism, and under very difficult conditions, with the shadow of the empire basically hanging over you constantly. And, what does the change in the leadership mean? Who are the new leaders? What does it represent? And of course, the implications down the road, because being the governing party means that there's an added scrutiny, added responsibility. We have some discussions around some CIA shenanigans in this country, a particularly worrisome case of gender-based violence of one very, very dangerous actor who was thankfully caught, but speaks to the type of behavior that we do see from U.S. agencies and why there is such a need to defend.
It's an outrage of a case.
Defend soberanía, defend sovereignty, because this is what gives you the instrument to keep these monsters out of our country who feel like they have the impunity to abuse everybody and anybody in the name of, the national security doctrine in the United States, but obviously, extending that to really grotesque behaviors. And of course, losers and haters, can't go without it. All right, so moving on to our first topic, opposition from the right to the far right. Thought we would open here with this tweet from you, Kurt. Maybe you can read it out and translate it for our guests here or for our audience. What's going on here? Why would we want to say that we're entering might be dangerous territory when it comes to the opposition in terms of their fanaticism?
We've talked in this program about, the history of the right in Latin America, right? We've talked in this program about the roots of the PAN and far right, Nazi-inspired or fascist-inspired ideologies of the 1930s, right? And we've also talked about the tendency of the right, like the Mexican right, which is not particularly democratic at all, when they don't have their areas of power, which was the judicial branch and the electoral institute, right, and these autonomous agencies for the executive branch. And they're routinely losing elections, and, they're very likely going to continue losing elections, as we talked about in the last episode, because they have no leadership, they have no message. The new leader of the PAN is even going to be worse than the old leader of the PAN, etc. So, things are not looking very good for them. They're in disarray in the PRI, in the PAN. Their prospects are not good. So you put all that together, plus, their origins, their origin story, plus their lack of democratic vocation, and you get a series of cases like we've seen in the last few weeks in Mexico. So my tweet says, a senator of the PAN, the right-wing party of the PAN, calls for the lynching of people who vote in favor of the judicial reform. Right? Now, lynching in Spanish is used more of a general term than it is in English, but the idea is to beat the hell out of people. Right? So before the vote on the judicial reform, this Maria de Jesus Diaz, the senator of the PAN, said, anybody who votes for the judicial reform in Congress should be beaten the hell up. Right? Then she tried to walk it back and said, "Oh, this is how we talk in my state, and Aguascalientes, and I'm blunt," and I said, and then she actually had to apologize more formally afterwards. But that was already out there. And dicho y hecho, as we say in Spanish, right? The day of the vote in the Senate on the judicial reform, what happens? We get a January 6th. Right? Where, a mob, a right-wing mob, storms the Senate. And here we see some of the footage, right, from outside of the Senate, very much, along the lines of the Capitol, right? They, and all the media coverage there, they storm in and they shake the door, and then somebody had a post, and they were beating on the inner door of the Senate, and they went in, made a whole, racket in there. And then one of the guys who you could see kind of at the beginning of this, who had the kind of the craziest look on his face, looked like he was really doped up on something, then fainted, and they had to get him out, and it was just all whatever else. And of course they were taking pictures with right-wing senators, right? Just all was missing was the paint and the horns. So they called for a recess from the podium and held the session in an alternative site, right? And finished passing the judicial reform, right? So that's one thing. Now, if we go back to my tweet, right, what comes next? What comes next after Mexico's mini January 6th, right? And after the calls for opposition senators to be beaten up. Next, the president of the Senate, the same person who called for the recess so that the session could be held in another setting, another venue, Gerardo Fernandez Noroña, right, was assaulted in an airport lounge, Terminal 2 airport lounge of Mexico City, right? The actual video of the assault was very carefully erased, but here we see kind of the post moments of the assault. He was assaulted by a lawyer from the state of Nuevo León, a guy by the name of Carlos Velázquez, who, not surprisingly, is a corporate lawyer that helps companies evade taxes. The old racket of the old days, right? Avoid paying taxes. Find any loophole. And there are plenty of them to be found, right? So one of the things that AMLO's been working on over the course of this, his sexennial, was to close some of these loopholes and get big companies to cough up and pay their back taxes, right? Only to then run into judges in the judicial branch, which would keep siding with the big companies and letting them off with massive tax payments, right? Interestingly, we just saw last week that the Supreme Court finally came down on Ricardo Salinas Pliego in total play with his huge back tax bill. I think he's got a total of $3 billion back tax bill. $3 billion. The public pressure has been working. They finally sided, with the Mexico's IRS against Salinas Pliego, and he's going to have to cough up some of that. So, as we see here, this Carlos Velasquez, assaults Noroña, grabs his phone, takes his phone for several minutes. Noroña finally gets it back, I think. Right? President of the Senate. Right? President of the Senate. Then what happens? Right? The Sunday, so this is would have been Sunday the 22nd, last few days of AMLO's term. He's doing his last tours, right? And on one of his tours, right, if we can pull up the coverage here it is, right? He's met by, this kind of smallish group of protesters from the judicial branch, the workers from the judicial branch, who have been protesting in different states. Right? They lost. It's over. The Constitution has been, amended. But someone decides to chuck a water bottle at AMLO, right? One of these guys with the, judicial Poder Judicial black T-shirt, right? So AMLO just kind of very deftly sidesteps the water bottle and moves on, right? So, in and of itself, not a big deal. But if we put it in the context of everything I've just talked about, right? Everything I've just talked about, which includes the calls for beating up people who vote for the judicial reform, the mini January 6th, the assault of Noroña, and now throwing a water bottle at the president. Right? Just imagine how the Secret Service would react in the U.S. if a water bottle landed anywhere near that close to the president, right? They would be all over those people, right? But, in this dictatorship of, and then I was thinking, well, maybe not, because then the whole Trump shooting thing, they kind of botched that one, right? But, if they had those people right there in front of them, I think that even the, Secret Service would react. But in this autocratic dictatorship of Mexico, nothing happened. Right? Everybody went home. Right? What a dictatorship we're living in.
Yeah.
So, right? So, all of this leads one to ask, and I'm very interested in hearing your point of view on this, Jose Luis, whither the Mexican right. Are they going to, give in to this temptation, this kind of malevolent swan song of, we've got to heat things up. Calentar la plaza, it's called, heating up the plaza, right? Which is kind of a strategy of tension, right? Are we going to heat things up? Is that the way things are going to roll now? Because this has all been 4 incidents very quickly over the course of the several weeks. Not one of them massive in and of themselves, except for rushing in the Senate, right? But indicative, as we look across them, of a pattern, right? Yeah. Of both language and action, right? So AMLO, has been, how critical of the right, but he's also said that the right has been responsible in his first term by, however ridiculous and exaggerated their rhetoric has been, they stayed within institutional channels. Do we see that maybe being abandoned in a second Morena term?
Yeah. And I think the part that worries me has been obviously the reaction by some, right? When you mentioned it here, right? That, they're flirting openly with violence. And then there was a certain normalization of this,
That's right?
That's like, well, that's what he gets. That's what he deserves. Or, for example, with the case of Noroña, which is like, what was he doing in the lounge of the airport, right? He was looking for trouble. Shouldn't he be hanging out with the poors? What's he doing in the business lounge, right? By the way, he was in the Amex lounge. Anybody who has an Amex card actually has access to it. And it's obviously somebody in a position like him. He obviously has lots of points accumulated from frequent travel and all the kind of rest of it. So it's not particularly surprising that he had access to the lounge, but the point being that this normalization, this effort to make it seem like it's nothing, or even like, oh, that, you know, Lopez Obrador, that's what he gets. Look at the rejection by the people of that. It's worth remembering that Lopez Obrador dissolved very early in his term the official Secret Service equivalent, el Estado Mayor Presidencial, because it was a nest of corruption and overpaid salaries, et cetera, and the rest of it, right? And travels with a very
bad
light
troubled history of being involved in the the '68 massacre in Tlatelolco and other things, right?
Very dark history there with some of the actors inside of that institution. And so he had a very light security detail throughout his term, you know, often traveled commercial, right? Having direct contact with the people. I remember right before he took office, he was still traveling via public transit where necessary, et cetera, et cetera. The point is that, you know, in comparison to the old regime and the security details and all of this that were required, right? It's actually kind of surprising that we only had maybe a handful of incidents where you could actually say that Lopez Obrador was, you know, somebody faced off with him or faced like a bottle throwing incident, right? It's not so much, you know, what was a bottle going to do, and if it did hit him, obviously it didn't. Good thing it didn't. But point being, the normalization, this flirting with violence, this accepting of it, this introducing it, the classist response to it, especially in comparison to the way things were before, right? If, you know, Peña Nieto couldn't leave without a heavy security detail.
Massive.
Because it would have been much worse. He might not make it out of it because of the generalized rejection, which actually also speaks to this moment that we're living in. You know, we opened the show talking about the fact that we're on the precipice of a change in government. Most presidents left with widespread rejection, right? We just finished watching last week the Grito de Independencia, Grito de Dolores here, right? Where people were screaming, es un honor estar con López Obrador, right? Whereas, what did Peña Nieto get? Rejection. Asesino, fue el Estado. Calderón, same way. Likewise, being criticized by that, right? Anytime that these people were even remotely close to the masses, their rejection was seen. And then we see these handful of incidences, right? Very, very few, to be honest, right? Considering this level of exposure. And in one of them, we see this kind of attitude. And that's for me the most worrisome. And the fact that it's a trend, right? Like you said, it started with calls. Then we saw mobs. Then we see this direct aggression on the president of the Senate. We even have this incident here outside of the courts here, where there's actually an attempt to attack one of the sitting Supreme Court justices here in Mexico, who's obviously sympathetic to the fourth transformation of Mexico, to López Obrador, but that kind of aggressive attitude. And the effort to normalize it is, I think, for me, the part that worries me, because then we'll only see escalation. We don't want to see this as part of the normalized kind of political discourse in this country, right? Like you said, well, can you imagine if the left had stormed the Senate when they were approving the privatization of education and electricity, as they did during Peña Nieto's term? Everybody involved would be rotting in a jail cell in this moment, at best.
Yeah, to this day, right? Remember what we talked about, not only the time of Peña Nieto, but, this is all recent history in Mexico, this disappearing of political leaders, right? This, Lopez Obrador talks about this, in his book, right? About how sometimes it was better back in the day for political leaders to actually be jailed, so they could actually survive inside rather than, meeting mysterious deaths outside. This is very recent history, in Mexico, right? And it's, it's not surprising, but it doesn't, cease to be disappointing that the leaders of the PRI and the PAN, who should be, condemning this kind of violence, have not been, right? They've been sitting it out. And that's just a tacit green light for this to continue. Right. So instead, besides now being seen as parties that are often traitors to the Republic, because they often go and cry, to the United States, to Washington, to Spain for foreign intervention, are we now going to see, besides having the moniker of traitors on them, are they now going to be seen as also the parties of violence? Right? Is that where they're going now? Have they given up on the democratic route, or they just or they resign themselves to losing? I mean, what's going on over there right? I'm sure they don't even have it clear, right?
No.
But it's really something to watch.
Well, and we know where this path ends, right? I often make comparisons to Venezuela, a country that experienced a transformation several decades ago now. Where did their opposition end up? In an insurrectionary strategy, in recognizing unknown figures as president, right? Just totally abandoning the democratic cause, even now, right? In this last election, finally deciding to operate and deciding to participate in the election, and then ultimately going through the same charade of calling for an insurrection, of calling to not recognize the result, their president-elect fleeing into exile, et cetera, right? Obviously not the president-elect. But this is the worrisome part, right? If we continue to normalize it, if we continue to promote this rhetoric, if they continue to flirt, then they're going to go from flirting to openly embracing because they are so marginalized, right? And that means that they'll try to paint themselves as the victims and try to cry to international human rights organizations. They'll go running to the OAS and say that they're political prisoners. There are limits to constitutional limits, legal limits to the kind of behavior that you engage in political action. And they are pursuing a very dangerous path. So let's hope they walk away from it. There are more sensible minds, although I'm not sure they're the ones in charge in the opposition. But it's something to watch out for.
And just very quickly before I move on, it's effectively a dare to the Morena government. We dare you to come after us or arrest us or apply the law, because then you'll look even more like a dictatorship in the eyes of the international press, right? United States. So we dare you. What are you going to do?
Yeah. And of course, it's interesting to see this in particular in comparison to Morena. You made this point. Last week we talked about how they're in disarray. This week we're talking about the ways that they are flirting with violence and a dangerous insurrectionary strategy. But on the other hand, you have Morena. You have Morena that just had yet another Congress. And we thought we would start this segment of the show with a video of Claudia Sheinbaum herself speaking to the situation in the country on the cusp of the transition. So it's very important to kind of put things in context. Well, Claudia Sheinbaum wins the election. She's the president-elect. She was handed over, quite literally, the baton of leadership from López Obrador in order to be the new leader, the face of Morena and its movement and its aims, et cetera, et cetera. But obviously being president means that now she has to govern for the whole of the country. She's actually requested a leave of absence as a member of the party in order to fulfill her responsibilities as the president of the republic. But she gave an address to the Congress to kind of say goodbye in that sense, in that partisan sense, and then obviously opening up a new door to the presidency. But we thought we would share just a little bit of the end of her speech. Now we're going to run it with English subtitles. And for those of you who are listening, we'll explain a little bit of what she says as soon as she finishes it. But we thought it was important to listen to what she has to say. And I think also how she says things, right? These are big shoes to fill. She's going to occupy the role once occupied by López Obrador, arguably the most charismatic political leftist leader in Mexico in modern history. So how is she doing in the face of that situation of needing to fill these big shoes? And I think we've seen a pretty good improvement on that regard, but we'll let the video run. And also this is where she's explaining some of the things that she thinks the party needs to focus on in this conjecture.
Los gobiernos emanados de Morena deben garantizar austeridad republicana, honestidad y la cercanía con el pueblo y el principio de que por el bien de todos, primero los pobres. 9. No puede haber colusión con la delincuencia, ni organizada ni con la de cuello blanco. 10. Luchemos siempre contra la discriminación, el racismo, el clasismo, el machismo y tengamos la certeza de que somos un instrumento del pueblo para seguir empoderándolo y con ello garantizando la transformación de México para alcanzar siempre más justicia y democracia en nuestro país. Compañeros, compañeras, ¿qué nos distingue? ¿Qué somos? Humanistas, que amamos nuestra patria y tenemos un profundo amor al pueblo de México y a nuestra historia. Nos indigna la discriminación, el clasismo, el racismo y el machismo, la desigualdad y la pobreza, y lucharemos hasta el último día de nuestras vidas porque las y los mexicanos puedan comer 3 veces al día comida saludable, puedan tener acceso a la educación, a la salud, al vestido y a la vivienda. No creemos en el consumismo, ni en el poder del dinero, ni en la avaricia. Y no nos arrodillamos nunca frente al poder del dinero, ni frente a ningún poder extranjero. Creemos en un pueblo de libertades, en un México de libertades, de justicia, un México soberano, de democracia verdadera, donde el que mande sea siempre el pueblo de México. ¡Que viva el presidente Andrés Manuel López Obrador! ¡Que viva la cuarta transformación! ¡Que viva Morena! ¡Que viva México!
There you go. I got a little bit of goosebumps there. She's definitely gotten better at the oratory, that's for sure. Kurt, what are your immediate impressions?
It was a rousing end to a successful speech at the Congress. And a few points to make. I think the first point is the clear one that you just made. How much better of a speaker she's got. Claudia Sheinbaum has always been a very effective speaker on a one-to-one or a small group basis. At the beginning, maybe she might have come across as a little bit wooden in bigger, front of bigger crowds. Well, no longer. No longer. I mean, she's really, I think that ending kind of brings that to the fore. Also, with regards to the speech, right? The speech started off talking about the successes of the first piso, the first floor of the 4T, and then lays out a lot of what she wants to do, right? And as we've talked about, she talked about having a single health service for the country, right? Working towards that, which is exciting. Some of the policies we've talked about of reducing the pension age for women down to 60, doubling railroad lines compared to what was built with the Tren Maya, now focusing on 2 lines going up north to the border, right? And a series of other, laying out her policy stall, right? But then I think, and this is probably the most interesting part of the speech, she comes out with a decalogue of kind of laying down the gauntlet to Morena, saying basically, don't screw this up as a party. Don't screw this up, right? We talked about how the right is in disarray. The right-wing parties are in disarray. Morena has just elected a new president of the party. Her name is Luisa Maria Alcalde. She is the outgoing governance secretary, right? There's no equivalent in the U.S. cabinet, but the governance secretary handles relationships between the federal government, and between the executive branch and other branches of government and other power centers in the government, basically so that the government, operates, fluidly. She's a young rising star in Morena, capably carried out her position in the cabinet, and is very much a consensus choice for the party. You'll be hard pressed to find anyone in Morena who opposes Luisa Maria Alcalde as head of the party, and that in itself is a big achievement, right? AMLO has talked about how the predecessor to Morena, the PRD, tore itself apart in these leadership contests. The 2000 leadership contest, the leadership contest following 2006 election, with some very bloody internal elections, which is why now Morena has moved away from internal elections towards a polling model, right? Kind of traumatized from that previous experience of the PRD. But Luisa Maria Alcalde is, people are happy with her. Right? And it's part of also the generation of women. So we see Claudia Sheinbaum as the president, we see Claudia Brugada as the mayor of Mexico City, really governor, and Luisa Maria Alcalde taking the reins of, this certainly the largest left party in Latin America. Right? So that in itself is important. And it's also important that both Luisa Maria Alcalde and Claudia Sheinbaum talked about watching out for this excessive pragmatism in the party. And that's coded language for don't have bad candidates. that, piss off the bases and make the party look bad in the eyes of the general public, right? And, there have been several cases we've talked about. I don't have to go through them again. This case of Lili Tellez, a former television news personality, news in quotes, who then became a senator on the Morena ticket and then abandoned the party and has become one of the most kind of ridiculous, but one of the most outspoken conservative voices in the Senate. We've had the case of Sergio Mayer, the Televisa personality, who did a term in the Congress and is back again and stirred up a lot of controversy there. So it's interesting that both of them talked about this. And this is part of Claudia's decalogue, right? So we see here on the screen this idea of the importance of internal cohesion for Morena. And Claudia lays it out. She said the party has to be unified, right? And that unity is built on the basis of principles that the party has worked for, right? And so nothing, she wants to hear nothing of internal divisions, right? And the like, right? She talks about how members of Morena have to behave themselves with honesty and simplicity. So to avoid, again, the siren song of corruption and privileges, to not permit, and this is her point, third point, amiguismos, which is string pulling for friends, influence peddling, and nepotism, like we saw in the judicial branch, or sectarisms, or an excess of pragmatism without principles, which is what I talked about. That's really pointed language against bad candidates. To not become a party of state, a bureaucracy of state, like the PRI did, which is just the electoral appendage of hegemonic state power. And her fifth point was to really work to reinforce the power of the Political Formation Institute, which works to provide political education to party members and to would-be candidates. That is very important. To continue to be both a party and a movement, which is always kind of a knife-edge thing, because once you're a party in power, the tendency is to bureaucratize yourself, become very comfortable in power, and leave the movement part behind. We saw what happened with the PT in Brazil. Doesn't want that to happen here. To guarantee, this is your seventh point, that the candidates are chosen by means of opinion polls. This is, of course, problematic. Morena should move to a primary system, but again, they're all very touchy about that because of the very bloody history, metaphorically, with the PRD. Morena governments have to guarantee Republican austerity not in the economic neoliberal sense, but in the sense of not overspending and using public funds instead of having lavish lifestyles to dedicate it for the less well-off. That there should not be collusion with any kind of delinquency, either organized crime or white-collar crime, which is an interesting binom that AMLO has discussed a lot, right? Neither organized crime nor white-collar crime, and always to work against discrimination, racism, classism, machismo, and to continue to be, an instrument of the people of Mexico. She says at one point, Morena's pueblo, right? Now, people certainly will disagree with that. But that's the ground they're working to occupy. This idea that Morena is pueblo. Morena is the patriotic party of Mexico. Morena is the party that represents the popular will of the Mexican people. That's the ground that they're looking to occupy. So this.
Yeah, I think just speaking generally, I thought her speech was well structured, kind of talking about the achievements, talking about the promises, and then this kind of, message to the party supporters. Like I mentioned that originally, it's good to see her improving, Unfortunately, I remember during her first speech from the Zócalo on the campaign trail, she kind of flubbed the first line. It's okay, these are jitters, it's normal, but she's certainly improved. I think she's learned a lot from doing these tours and accompanying the president as he's been visiting different projects and handing over, the keys to the palace to her by kind of including her in this transition period. So in that sense, it's been good. It's interesting. I put this up on the screen here. You mentioned it, right? The headline here is internal cohesion, the challenge for Luisa María Alcalde, the new president of the party, in Morena, according to experts. But I think in a way, that's kind of what they want to frame. There's always been this insistence that Morena is a Big Ten coalition that could only be held together by López Obrador. I think the experience of this Congress shows that's not true. Like you said, I think it's worth highlighting that Luisa María Alcalde is not only young and talented and having had a long history in the labor secretariat and then the internal ministry secretariat, but of actually bringing the party together, of being that cohesion candidate. There was some discussion about different actors coming forward to occupy that role. She was obviously very capable in reuniting the different factions, if you will, although they don't officially exist. I thought it was worth mentioning as well that López Obrador's son was tapped to be the Secretary General. And I was curious to hear what you have to say, because, there's the birth of López Obrador's legacy, blah, blah, blah. And before I hand it over to you, I think it's important to remember that not everything needs to be seen through the lens of a U.S.-centric kind of focus. Yes, in the United States, you have many family members who are deeply involved in politics. We had a son, and then and president or father being president, George H.W. Bush and George W. Bush. We've seen the Clintons very active, a whole family there, the Kennedys, of course. But in Mexico, certainly on the left, this tradition is actually well regarded. Who was seen as the most admired president in Mexico in the 20th century? Well, it was Lázaro Cárdenas, right? General in the Mexican Revolution. And then who was the standard bearer of the left before López Obrador? It was his son, Cuauhtémoc Cárdenas. And in fact, Cuauhtémoc Cárdenas' son is a member of Claudia Sheinbaum's team, has a lot of experience internationally, et cetera, et cetera. And so it's not exactly unusual in Mexican politics that children of prominent figures become involved and for their own, based on their own merits, actually end up occupying a place of influence, like we saw with Cuauhtémoc Cárdenas and subsequently his son as well, the grandson of Lázaro Cárdenas. So what do you think about, López Obrador's son and the Secretary General?
So I think it's important to point out that AMLO was very careful not to name any of his sons to official government positions in his administration. That was very clear, right? And, we see clearly why. You can't make the case against, nepotism, in the judicial branch, then have your sons in positions in the government. But this is a different matter. This is the party, right? And Andy, as he's known, is going to have an important role in territorial organizing, which is absolutely something that Morena really needs to do, right? Organizing, outside of the capital and in, other parts of the country that are very different, from Mexico City. And this is why we see that, a lot of the Morena governments outside of Mexico City haven't been as successful as, the federal government, right? And I can speak as that from living in Oaxaca, right? So that kind of territorial organizing is very important. Now, Andy, of course, has been active in that before, right? And is also, of course, has a lot of foot experience in his father's 3 presidential campaigns. So, it would be, I think, silly for Morena to not tap that experience.
Yeah, absolutely.
And I think also it's important to have, again, a point of contact with the López Obrador family, right? Not in an official government position, but, somewhere in the party itself.
Yeah. And I think you're right. It's worth highlighting that López Obrador said, my family members will not be active in my government, but obviously he's leaving. And so now they do have that open to them, and we'll see how he does. I mean, I really liked also Claudia's emphasis on, what we call shoe leather organizing, right? Like pounding the pavement. There's a really famous photo of her with a big old stack of Regeneración in her arm. Like that's what the political work looks like. And she really emphasized that as well. And that actually reminds me, before we move on to the next topic, I came across this video here of López Obrador talking about it now that he's about to leave office, right? And he's like, there's people out there who say it's going to be like before. It's going to be just like the way that was the previous administrations, more bourgeois government. He's like, nope, no. I'll take this opportunity to let you know, in good faith, I am bougie. He says in Spanish, fresa. The bougie one is me. And obviously there we see these clips of Claudia Sheinbaum. And it's true. I mean, if you really have to kind of look at their political trajectories, Claudia has always been to the left of López Obrador. She was never a member of the establishment parties, right? She was a grassroots organizer in the university. And in fact, the organization that she belonged to sought explicitly to build links between the countryside and workers in the cities as well, kind of a very classic organizing concept of bringing together the cities and the countryside. I was active in the student movement and a socialist student movement and a militant movement. And obviously throughout her terms in office. Her emphasis has always been, similarly to López Obrador, but universal social programs. These are your rights. These are not privileges. These are not, temporary programs. This is what you are entitled to. This is what the Constitution defends. She has said that she wants to be remembered as the president of, education, et cetera, et cetera. So this idea that, it's going to be attack to the center, attack to the right, I think her speech also speaks to the fact that that's not where she's headed. That's not what she wants. And I think the fact that there was definitely kind of a couple of winks there to be like, do a good job in the territories and the states and the candidates that you're choosing. So again, feeling encouraged by the signs that we have so far, now that we're days away from her actually taking office.
Yeah, so, we've talked about this on the program too, right? This idea that some of these commentators are saying there has to be attack to the center, which I think is more wishful thinking from their part, because Claudia is clearly, at least ideologically, certainly to the left of AMLO. AMLO comes from a national popular tradition, and there's a lot of good stuff in there, right? But, Sheinbaum, a little bit younger, right? Comes from a more ideologically left position, and has been very consistent in that ever since her days in student organizing, all the way up through governance. Right. One thing I did want to point out, which I think is interesting, after Claudia ended her speech, as occurs at all of Morena events, and actually AMLO's events in government as well, they ended by everybody standing up and singing the national anthem. Now that's very common in Mexico, right? But not so much in the global north, right? It would be very rare for a left party in the global north at the end of a political event for everybody to stand up and to sing the national anthem, right? But in Mexico, that's a very common thing, right? And this speaks again to the success of Morena and of AMLO, of, as I talked about in my Jacobin piece that's on the screen here, reappropriating discourses that have been hijacked by the right, not only in Mexico, but in other countries. One of the discourses is anti-corruption, right? And AMLO made corruption the topic of Morena, going after the corruption of the right. But the other one is patriotism. If we just scroll down a little bit to the next paragraph, right? Also reappropriating that discourse, right? And, AMLO was kind of the quintessence of that, right? With his regional accent, love of colorful phrases, endless tours of the country, extolling of the nation's history, culture, and cuisine. He was the quintessential Mexican, in contrast to an opposition all too willing to run off to Washington at the slightest pretense and a desperate attempt to provoke Uncle Sam intervening at its bidding. So if you want to ask yourself why there's been a class realignment in Mexico, right, as we saw in the numbers in this election, part of it has to do with, policies that support the working class. The outsourcing reform, the trade union reform, minimum wage, vacations, rising wages, right? Profit sharing and the like, right? But there's also a deft use of political symbolism, right? That Morena is, when I go back to what Claudia said, Morena is pueblo, right? That Morena is the patriotic party against those parties that would sell us out to the United States or sell us out to Spain or provoke violence, right? And that's important. That's important. I was talking with José before the program. If movie buffs like me, at the end of the show, end of the movie, Deer Hunter, which talks about America's brutal, history in Vietnam, right? An ex-soldier comes back, Robert De Niro, his pal committed suicide, right? Christopher Walken. And they're kind of commemorating this guy. And they're in a working class town in Pennsylvania, right? In the western working class part of Pennsylvania. And at the end, kind of, they raise a glass to their friend who committed suicide after his war trauma. And they all start singing God Bless America. Now, I'm not saying anyone should sing God Bless America, but I think it was a really interesting an honest portrayal of working class Pennsylvania. Right, and what people like that might have done at that moment, right? It's not saying yeah America. It's saying that's what people have done. So Morena can very unselfconsciously sing the national anthem, right? Now I understand why in the North that can't happen as easily, because patriotism in the North is a very toxic thing tied to an imperial project, in a way that it's not in the global south. So I'm not suggesting that the left in the U.S. start singing God Bless America. I'm making a movie reference, that's it. But I am talking about why this can work in Mexico, and that there is something that can be learned by managing political symbolism in a way that doesn't see ground to the right as we're the patriots here. Right? Interesting to think about.
I wholeheartedly agree. And in fact, it's interesting you mentioned that. Great minds think alike, as we say, right? We're both reading Gracias in anticipation of the live stream on Sunday. Again, Sunday, 5 p.m. Mexico. We'll be doing a live stream. But also, this concept is actually something I wrote about for the Mexico Solidarity Project Bulletin, which comes out tomorrow on Wednesday. So look for that in your inboxes. But I figured I would actually read a piece of it here because it's very much along those same lines. It's actually something that I was reflecting on precisely because we just finished going through the Independence Day celebrations. Now, for some of you who may not be familiar with a little bit of my history, I was born here in Mexico, but we left when I was very young. I left when I was 2 years old, and I grew up in the United States and Canada. So I've kind of reflected a little bit on that experience for this column, and I'm going to read some of it for you here. Despite having spent very little time in Mexico before we left, I always felt Mexican, an identity that served as a vaccine, protecting me from being infected by the white supremacist cultural instruments that I was surrounded by at the time. With time and political education, I eventually came to realize that these chauvinist and jingoistic narratives, so heavily promoted in the US and Canada, were crafted to serve the interests of imperialism. As a result, I developed a discomfort with the concept of national pride or nationalism. It is a bourgeois ideology, after all, which serves the ruling class at the cost of the masses. So how do I reconcile this with my pride being Mexican? Well, while I used to wear my Mexican identity as a shield, a tool to protect me from attempts at assimilation, today, living in Mexico and contributing what I can to its political transformation, I am prouder than ever to call myself Mexican. I do not advocate for hollow patriotism, one that is emptied of its political content. I defend my identification with Mexicanidad, not from a place of chauvinistic nationalism, but rather due to my convictions in support of national liberation. Mexico's fourth transformation, drawing on inspiration from the previous three transformations, our fight for independence, Benito Juárez and the 19th century reforms, and the Mexican Revolution of 1910, is a struggle for national liberation. We are fighting to end foreign domination, and we should be honest about the stakes. In Mexico, we are attempting a peaceful transition. In the shadow of the US, we are defending our sovereignty, our right to self-determination. As workers of oppressed nations advance in our fight for national liberation, imperialism shows its true face. As political theorist Max Eil said, national liberation is what's moving the world. You can either get with it or get out of the way. So that's just a little clip of what I wrote for the Mexico Solidarity Project Bulletin. It comes out every Wednesday in both English and Spanish. You can go to Mexico Solidarity Project to sign up and choose whatever language you want. But I thought I would share that because it's a bit apropos given the topic. You know, this is something that certainly as a leftist I've kind of tried to reconcile with, and I feel comfortable with that. With where we're at. And for sure, you know, they sang the anthem at the end of AMLO's Informe that we went to. And it felt good to be in that crowd singing our anthem. Okay, so we're running a little bit short on time here, but we wanted to talk about the CIA and its shenanigans. And of course, bringing this here, and I'll read just a little bit of the lead and the headline here, so you get an idea of what we're talking about. Former CIA officer sentenced to 30 years for sexually assaulting scores of women. Brian Jeffrey Raymond of California was found guilty of drugging and raping women in his government apartments. A former CIA officer was drugged and sexually assaulted dozens of women, was sentenced to 30 years in prison on Wednesday, Department of Justice announced. Brian Jeffrey Raymond, 48, of La Mesa, California, drugged more than 24 women and performed non-consensual sexual acts or made sexual contact with at least 10 women, the Justice Department said in a press release. Raymond also photographed and recorded videos of victims without their consent while they were drugged or otherwise incapacitated. Raymond had previously worked for the CIA for more than 20 years, et cetera, et cetera. Now, where was some of that service done? Right here in Mexico. He was stationed here in Mexico City.
So what is so disgusting about this case? Right? What is so disgusting about this case? Let me count the ways. Right? The first disgusting thing is that we're not just, one woman is one too many, obviously. But this guy Raymond did this to 28 women in Mexico, at least 28 women in Mexico. a lot of the women didn't even know that this had been done to them until they had pictures shown to them that had happened because they'd been drugged, right? And U.S. government paid for housing in Polanco, the wealthiest district of Mexico City, right? This guy Raymond did this over 14 years, from 2006 to 2020, right? Using Tinder when Tinder was a thing, and then using other means before that. So he, handsome guy, spoke Spanish, right? Would invite women back to his apartment and then drug them, and then, not only sexually assault them, but then take pictures of them. So he was dumb enough to incriminate himself, right? What about the people who don't, right? Because they found all these pictures and videos, right? Where was the CIA all this time? Where the hell was the CIA all this time? 28 women in Mexico. Other countries, they talk about Peru. The CIA refuses to say how many, countries he did this in, right? They're saying, we cooperate, and how good that he was arrested and jailed and sentenced. 4 years after he was arrested, they're still not coming clean on what countries he did this in and what his role was. What was he doing? What was he doing? Because he was assigned to the U.S. Embassy. He was the first secretary of the U.S. Embassy for 2 years. Right here in Mexico. Right? So when people say that the U.S. Embassy is simply a nest of CIA agents, well, they're not wrong. And not only, intelligence agents, but the worst human beings on the planet. Working with absolute impunity in government-paid-for housing in Polanco. 28 women over, in Mexico, who knows in other countries, doing this over 14 years. Do you think the CIA stopped him? They did not, my friends. The CIA did not stop him. He was stopped because a naked woman ran out on the balcony of his apartment and screamed for help. And he was arrested by the Mexico City police, which then couldn't touch him because he had diplomatic immunity and was whisked off to the United States before the Mexican authorities could get a full accounting of what he'd done in this country, which we're very likely never going to get because he got a plea bargain, as we've talked about in other cases. This is why the Mexicans hate this idea of plea bargains, because these people go off to the United States, they do a deal, whole thing is sealed, right? Yes, he got 30 years. Okay, right? Should have gotten a lot more, right? But what Mexicans want to know is what this criminal did here. But no, diplomatic immunity, he's whisked off, gets a plea bargain, it's all hushed up. And it's interesting that the U.S. press, yes, they did report on it. They didn't completely cover it up. They did report on it. They couldn't not. But the Spanish language press is actually a lot more extensive on it. If you read, for example, the Guardian article compared to the article in the Spanish newspaper El País, which goes into a lot more detail. Right? Because the function of the American press always is to cover up, and to the extent that they can, and protect U.S. intelligence agencies. So that's why you saw them laundering DEA talking points with this whole narco Claudia thing. They tried to intervene in the Mexican election this year. Just laundering DEA talking points, right? And we've seen the laundry list of DEA corruption, right? A laundry list of DEA corruption, right? Including the former DEA head of the DEA in Mexico, Palmieri, getting whisked out of here after it was found out that he was, palling around with defense lawyers for drug traffickers in Miami. And this isn't the only case of the CIA doing this either. This isn't the only case of the CIA. There was the case about 15 years ago about the head of the CIA in Algeria raping 2 Muslim women. So this isn't just an isolated case. And you can understand it, can't you? It's funny that the defense for this guy, Raymond, the defense argued that, he basically had been traumatized because of his near military work in the CIA in and around the times of the 2001, and all of that, right? And that had dehumanized him and made him see women as objects. Well, yeah, because that's how the CIA roles, right? And all the more so if you're a Mexican woman or an Algerian woman, which the mentality within these agencies is basically to see them as subhuman anyway. So what does it matter what you do with them? What does it matter what you do with them? Just look at the kind of the Trumpian far right rhetoric of who Mexicans are, or Algerians, or anybody Arab, and just imagine what the mentality is inside the CIA, right? Oh, well, sometimes you got to do these things to get information out of them, or, torture is normalized. So sexual abuse is normalized because they're not really human to them. Not really human to them. Totally subhuman. And so, of course, the CIA never intervened. It required a woman screaming on a balcony for the Mexico City police to get involved, and then he's whisked out of the country. And then you wonder why Mexicans have a reflexive distrust of anything reeking of the U.S. government and U.S. operations. Right? And they say, why don't they want to cooperate with us on drug issues? Why would they want to cooperate with you on any goddamn thing, on anything? When their agents come down here, do whatever they want, have carte blanche, diplomatic immunity, get whisked out of the country if something goes wrong. And how many other Brian Jeffrey Remens have there been that weren't caught, that were smart enough to not have a woman go out on the balcony and to not have all their stuff on their phones? How many others have there been? They come down here and it's either, eternal spring break Mexico or things that are a lot darker than that. A lot darker than that. And then if you try to get anything out of these agencies, oh no, it's an issue of national security. No, it's not. It's an issue of rape. It's not national security and the subhuman treatment of people. So this is why almost government has been painting lines and saying intelligence agencies can't do this and can't do that, and they have to report here and they have to report there. They're doing their own shit anyway. But just imagine this, José Luis. Just imagine this case. I still can't get over it.
I think you hit the nail on the head when you said, what does this say about their mentality? These three-letter agencies, the DEA, the CIA, they cannot be trusted. This is what their agents are up to while they're here. This is why it's appropriate to ask, what are they up to? This is why it's appropriate for the government to put limits on them. And I think you're absolutely right by also pointing to the fact that there's almost a reflection of rejection amongst the population as a whole, because this is what we're exposed to constantly. And this is what we know about. Right. This is the stuff that comes to light. And you mentioned the fact that, he ended up incriminating himself. I don't think it was because he was dumb. I think it was because he was overconfident, because he's used to living with impunity, of being able to do whatever they want, of this generalized attitude amongst these three-letter agencies that the global south, that places like Mexico are places full of people that can be treated this way. And even if you get caught, there will be no consequence for it. Well, I'm glad there was consequence in this one. But I think that this should serve as an opportunity to reflect on just how much we actually are allowing these agents to do in this country. And also to remember that when you see these stories about López Obrador's alleged ties to organized crime groups that were laundered through so-called progressive outlets by former DEA officials or anonymous sources inside of these agencies, that there's a reason behind their behavior, because they're used to getting away with everything, up to and including the sexual assault of people, of women in the countries that they're working. So yes, limits make sense and should be defended.
Oh yes, at the least, right? And there's as it's coming out, there's also a culture of sexual assault right there in Langley itself, right? There's the case right now, right? The AP reported on of Donald Asquith, a CIA agent who was assaulting women at parties, right? Saying, really just sticking his hand up. We don't have to go into detail here, but if they feel like they have that degree of impunity at Langley, just imagine the mentality when they come to Mexico or go to Algeria or anywhere else where the preset prejudices come in and this superiority mentality kicks in. Very, very dark stuff, right? And that's got to end.
Yeah. Okay, so we're almost out of time here. In that case, we're just going to move on just to the very end here. We got a quick comment on the losers and haters of this week. And, if you're ever curious how someone who loves the taste of boots thinks, just head on over to Dolia Esteves' Twitter page. Here we have her latest tweet. She's based in Washington. She has Beltway brain to the nth degree, but says, do you know how many constitutional amendments have been approved in the United States since 1791? 27 in 233 years. You know when the last one was? 1992. In democratic countries, changing the Constitution is not like changing your socks. That's what electoral autocracies or banana republics do. So there you have it. Dolia Esteves, who I believe is Mexican, thinks her own country is a banana republic.
Nominally.
You know what? Yeah, go get your U.S. citizenship. You fucking love the taste of their shoes. So go ahead.
And it's funny that now that Morena is about to pass this raft of constitutional reforms, she's so against constitutional reforms because a democracy, in quotes, like the United States only has 27 constitutional amendments. There probably should be a hell of a lot more in the United States. Hell of a lot more. Right? Hell of a lot more. Starting with the judicial power in the United States. Right? But they can't. Right? And even if you look at the numbers, I've got the numbers right here. AMLO so far has reformed 83 articles of the Constitution. Enrique Peña Nieto, his predecessor, 156, José Luis. 156. His conservative predecessor, practically double, right? With the whole pact from Mexico and this, all the collusion of parties back then and all their neoliberal reforms. He counter-reformed, practically double the amount of articles that AMLO has. Go back to Felipe Calderón, 110 articles. 110, right? 30% more than AMLO. I wonder what Dolia Esteves' opinion on constitutional reforms was back then. Or has she always been against, this excessive reforming of the Constitution?
I think in particular what's so unnerving about some of these attitudes, right? These are the same people who love Obama and they loved Macron. And these people are not Democrats. Macron just finished carrying out a coup against the left in his own country, appointing a prime minister from the right with the support of the far right, which was the whole point of the election in the first place, right? Is that democracy? Is droning people and assassinating them democratic, like Obama did? She loves the U.S., but has she said anything about the fact that they're funding and supporting, giving explicit approval to a genocide? Is that democratic? That sounds a lot more like banana republic behavior than any kind of democracy. And then inventing terms. What is an electoral autocracy? Come on. Like, these people are just afraid of the masses. They loved it when they got the fat contracts from the presidencia, right? That's probably what this is really about. Got to keep up that lavish lifestyle. These people are pathetic and shouldn't be listened to.
Award for ingratiating toady of the decade, right? Obama can drone bomb and whatever else, and Biden can fund genocide, but they didn't amend the Constitution, so it's okay.
Well, they didn't have to. Their Constitution allows the U.S. president to do whatever he wants.
Yeah.
Anyway, all right. Before we go, wrap up the episode here, I want to remind everybody we're having a live stream this coming Sunday at 5 p.m. in Mexico City time. Mexico says goodbye to AMLO, retrospective on the president's life and politics, with myself, su servidor, Kurt Hackbarth, and special guest Violeta Vázquez Rojas and Juan Pablo Morales Garza. It brings us to the end of another episode. I did want to shout out our members. We have quite a few now. Give me a second here. Elfin Woodchuck, Franklin Mount, Weeaboo Pleb, Carolina Quiroz, CBKM0, Ismael Castaneda, Becky Iconoclast, Ernie F. Ramos, Mar Dueñas, Paul Yeatman, our newest members here, joining us, supporting us. We really appreciate it.
Thank you.
Like, we really do, actually. Right? Like, we're still working on this effort here to try to, what was the phrase that I like so much? Break through the noise. Break through the noise on Mexico.
So we appreciate it. My first album cover. Kurt Hackbarth, Breaking Through the Noise.
I used to say that if I ever started a group, it would call the Pink Collar Ghetto. Is a term I learned in sociology, and I was like, "That's a great band name."
Oh,
Anyway, it's like social services, education; those are called Pink Collar Ghettos. Anyway, thanks so much for joining us. As always, I'm José Luis Granados Ceja. Kurt, any last words?
I didn't say it at the beginning, so I'm going to say it now. Thank you for joining us for another edition of Soberanía.
We'll see you next time.